And welcome to the first business session of our symposium. I am looking forward to exciting conversations over the next 3 days. We had an exhilarating inauguration, set the tone for the conversations for these 3 days. And I'm very grateful that all of us are here on time. Practitioners are often not known to be very punctual, but I want to set the record right and wanted to start right on time. We still have a place empty on the stage, but we will carry on nonetheless. There are arrangements for translation into Spanish. I can't say it in Spanish, so I think I'll ask Anna to say that in Spanish.
Buenos días a todos y a todas. Los que necesiten interpretación, por favor pasen, igual que anoche, aquí atrás a la camarita esta de traducción para recoger audífonos y eso les va a ayudar. Y si necesitan cualquier ayuda, me pueden encontrar a mí.
Muchas gracias. Thank you so much. Today, we will start off with a discussion which will try to explore some of the key themes of the symposium. They were introduced, they were problematized yesterday in the opening conversations. Today we will delve deeper, and the basic structure is every morning we will have a plenary. Through the day we will have breakout sessions which will explore themes, which will be practitioner huddles. There will be interthematic conversations. And then we will gather together again at 4:30 every evening to get a sense of where the conversation is leading. So that's going to be the recurring pattern for the next 3 days. Setting an agenda, picking through the issues in finer detail, having conversations, sharing experiences and insights, and then gathering together in the evening to summarize for ourselves what we learned during the day. Today, we have an exciting conversation, but I would also like to let you know that we have made a sort of ICT-enabled participatory methodology, which is, there is a WhatsApp number. I know we are only on WhatsApp, but this is a number which I would like all of you to record. And if you have any questions based on the discussion here, please send us a message on this number. We will be having your message here, and in the course of the conversation, we will ask those messages or those questions to the speakers. So if you have a question for a speaker, name the speaker for whom you have a question or a comment. Name yourself if you want to be identified. So note this number. This is for you to participate. So we are not having mics floating around. We will work with WhatsApp. Democratization gives everybody the opportunity. You can keep yourself anonymous. You can also not stand up if you're feeling shy, etc., etc. The unfortunate part is, if it's a Spanish question, we will require some translation. We hadn't thought of that. So don't worry, we will try to improvise as we go along. So Spanish questions will also be hosted. For those of you who love social media and communicating to the rest of the world, wherever you are, these are some, whatever they are called, hashtags, etc., etc. I'm not too familiar with them, but I'm sure those who are familiar will note it down. Those who are not familiar, don't bother. Okay. Hindi and Kannada translation also available. Please collect your headsets. So Spanish, Hindi, Kannada, all 3 languages available. हिंदी में भी आपको अगर सुनना है तो जो हेडसेट है पीछे मिल रहा है, ले लीजिएगा, उसमें हिंदी ट्रांसलेशन भी आपको मिलेगी. हाँ, जोर से मत बोलिए, अच्छा रहेगा. Okay, WhatsApp number requires a +91, our international code, so that you can reach us. So those are housekeeping questions. I don't think there's anything else. Let us get to the business. The theme we will be exploring together today is social accountability and citizenship in a globalized world. We have a very, very exciting panel here. I will introduce them to you, and we will be basically having a conversation among each other. So now, down to business. Let me first quickly introduce the panelists here from... That better? Okay. So let me first introduce the panelists who we have here, and then we will dive into the conversation. On the extreme left there, familiar to many of you in India who work on social accountability, it's Soumya Kidambi. Soumya started off by being part of the very, very core sort of civil society and social movements. Many of us know her from her work with MKSS. We heard about MKSS and its work yesterday evening. But Soumya then tried to see that this kind of social accountability can be mainstreamed into government programs. And she is currently the director of Society for Social Audits, Accountability and Transparency at the Department of Rural Development, Government of Telangana. So hold your questions about how does the government civil society relationship work. That's for Soumya. Next, we have an empty space. Bezwada Wilson will be joining us. Next is Rajat Khosla. Rajat is currently the Human Rights Advisor for Department of Reproductive Health Research at the World Health Organization. He's a lawyer, but I know very clearly he is a civil society person as well, deep in his heart. He wears a sort of more formal intergovernmental multilateral hat right now, but you can ask him all the civil society questions, and we would like an inside view into the international bureaucracy through his eyes. Next to him, Mulumba Moses, Executive Director at Serud in Uganda, another lawyer on the stage, which is good. We have accountability, but not legal accountability, and these lawyers are looking at social accountability with a very strong law background. And Moses uses international human rights to interrogate how these provisions get implemented in country work, and he will be talking about it. Then we have Jonathan Fox. People who read about social accountability must be familiar with that name, because Jonathan has been using his keen analytic vision to understand how social accountability and social movements work together to move the stage around public policy. He's worked for years with civil society and peasants organization in Mexico, but then shifted to Washington, D.C. to keep a closer eye on intergovernmental processes. I welcome all of you. Next to me is an old friend and colleague, Anuj Kapilashrami, again, migrated from the world of civil society into the world of academia. Anuj is currently a senior lecturer in global health policy at Queen Mary University of London, and she bridges the world of research and activism. I know it from personal experience. She's an extremely engaged activist of the People's Health Movement in the UK. So I think that together we can have a very meaningful conversation in terms of questions we will pose to our panelists. Please join in when you feel you too have a question. So, to begin our business, we will have a round of questions. I'll request you not to speak too elaborately. We've already talked about 7 minutes or so for opening comments. We'll follow up with questions, and then we'll get questions from the audience through social media. So let's start with Jonathan. Over here, you're the theoretician, right? You've been looking at accountability and relationships between citizens and state for 30 years now. You've looked at relationships between peasant communities and the state in Mexico, and you've also studied the World Bank. From this kind of close interrogation, what are your thoughts? Yesterday we heard about citizenship and its problems. How do you see this citizenship, governance, and accountability playing out in actual practice?
Thanks, Abhijit. I'd like to take this opportunity to reflect on three of the key words that are part of our conference theme, citizenship, governance, and accountability, in a broad sweep of history. If we think back to the period when COPASA was founded in 2011, and there's been quite a set of dramatic changes in the global context, and I'll just say a few words about both those broad changes and where COPASA fits in those broad changes. At that time, transparency, accountability reforms were spreading around the world at national, local, and global levels, across sectors, including health. Can you hear me? Back in 2011, the center of the mainstream center of gravity in the field was shifting, opening up at least some space at the margins for some institutional recognition of the legitimacy of community voice. And COPASA began to occupy some of that space. And at least in some places, some of the time, citizen action from below and policy reform from above seemed to be coming together to create new possibilities for shifting power and including the excluded. If we fast forward today, we find ourselves at a very different moment in history. Back in 2011, many of us, for example, held very high hopes about the power of information. Yet we were not strongly focused on what we now see as the power of disinformation. This threat is now fully global. I don't have to tell you about that. But I mention this change in global context because it helps to frame the debates about the nature of the terms that we use, like citizenship, governance, and accountability. If we think of citizenship then and now, back in 2011, the mainstream of the emerging social accountability field rarely spoke of citizenship. Instead, mainstream international NGOs and international organizations used more of a discourse of clients, of beneficiaries, or of generic, undifferentiated local communities. And in contrast, COPASA's founders were talking about rights, the foundation of citizenship. If we fast forward to today, the difference is now clearer between those who see community voice as just a source of better data, linked with efforts to perhaps broker a few meetings with local officials, in contrast to the idea of citizens' rights to make claims on duty bearers who have a responsibility to listen. Plus, I would add a rights-based approach challenges the mainstream of the social accountability field internationally to take the threats of reprisals into account much more explicitly. And here we're going to have a whole session at this conference to take into account the implications of changing civic space for our work. Another relevant shift when it comes to rights from then and now involves the convergence between the social accountability and the legal empowerment fields, as discussed in the work of our colleague Anu Joshi. And here several organizations will be sharing their work to bridge community monitoring for health accountability, as in Guatemala, in Macedonia, and Mozambique, and elsewhere. And this approach focuses on the importance of community paralegals, the counterparts of community health workers, community paralegals who try to squeeze bits of justice out of unjust systems, who try to use the tools of law in spite of the lack of the rule of law. And these legal rights defenders coincidentally came together in their own global legal empowerment network, NAMATI, which was founded in the very same year as COPASA, in this moment of optimism and hope and possibility back in 2011. Another new way of thinking about citizenship that is relevant is to recognize that honest public servants are citizens too. And those who put the public interest first often run significant risks, and we need more creative approaches to recognize and support them. And so it's no coincidence that here at this conference we have a whole conference track to recognize the community health workers as crucial actors for accountability. And one last major change in the discourse since 2011 involves the challenge of how to balance the power of the term citizenship to evoke the right to have voice and standing at the same time as we address the risks that term has to potentially have exclusionary effects of leaving out migrants and refugees and the stateless. If we turn to governance, then and now. And last night, Aruna reminded us of the very different ways in which that term is understood. Back in 2011, governance and health were seen, at least by most rights-oriented CSOs, as two very different fields, far apart from each other. The mainstream of the field of health governance took a very top-down approach, at best treating community monitoring of health service provision as a useful information-gathering tool that could help policymakers to identify leakage or absenteeism, but their anti-corruption strategies, for example, limited their reach by rarely tapping the potential of contribution of grassroots oversight. And these top-down approaches to health governance left out accountability failures like racist or misogynist abuse. But also back in 2011, conventional social accountability tactics ignored governance systems. Even when we think of the causes of, for example, of medicine stockouts or informal payments, they lie far upstream inside the governance system, far from the reach of the local interface meetings that became so popular between frontline staff and communities. Yet COPASA was an exception back then. With SEGS in Guatemala, for example, even building the ideas of governance and health system into the name of the organization. And COPASA members strategically pursued change strategies that connected broad-based community monitoring with health rights advocacy at multiple levels, linking oversight at local, district, state, and national levels, like the work through the National Rural Health Mission with Sati and Maharashtra, for example, as well as our Peruvian colleagues from Foro Salud and the Department of Puno represented here. If we fast forward to today, there's much more widespread recognition in our field that while community monitoring sheds light on the receiving end of health system failures, we also need broader strategies to identify and address the causes of these systemic problems. And these more systemic approaches can help to identify possible allies and not always obvious entry points for change. And here we have broader ideas like accountability ecosystems, which point to the need to activate the full array of public oversight institutions like right to information systems, like audit bureaus, like ombuds agencies, public prosecutors, and human rights commissions. If we look also at accountability then and now, back in 2011, the mainstream international agenda setters in our field, as they promoted the term social accountability, the term had a convenient and deliberate ambiguity, ranging from very brief, superficial, top-down, light touch, exclusively local interventions with no real organizing involved, to multi-pronged, multi-actor campaigns that link grassroots organizing to policy advocacy. And some of us welcome the term's potential to provide at least some mainstream legitimacy, funding, and hopefully, therefore, at least some partial protection for grassroots organizers who had very little room for maneuver on the ground. And if we look back, I would argue that this breadth of the term was both a strength and a limitation. If one looks back at the large mainstream international actors, the international NGOs and international organizations that adopted the term, including some governments, social accountability allowed them to explicitly distance these participatory innovations from politics, which perhaps rendered them vulnerable to backlash. And it also allowed a certain sidestepping of the agenda involving the need for the rule of law, which social accountability is not able to deliver. Plus, the conventional local light touch approaches to social accountability of the mainstream organizations tend to ignore the prior legacies of much more critical social movement-led accountability strategies. For example, the mainstream approaches focusing exclusively on the local face of public service providers left out diverse legacies of public interest campaigns to hold, for example, private corporate power accountable. Let's remember Bhopal, for example. Again, on all of these fronts, COPASA was an exception, engaging constructively with the idea of social accountability to address systemic problems, including health rights violations. And now the role of the private sector here is one of the top agendas for us at this conference. So these different uses of the term social accountability played out in the broader context of very different ideas of what the term accountability means more generally. Because accountability discourses mean different things in different contexts to different peoples in different languages. And one of the key issues that's at stake now in these debates is whether the whole idea of accountability is some kind of externally imposed notion, a tool of top-down control, or whether it emerges organically from below as part of democratic struggles to change the relationships between peoples and their governments. If we put it another way, and this has to do with the power of language that Aruna referred to last night, is the English language term accountability inherently technocratic and foreign, and therefore alienating, associated with financial reporting, box ticking, and surveillance, alienated from most cultures and pro-people local actors, or is the idea of accountability, in contrast to the term, perhaps understood in different ways in different cultures, a bright banner that we can fly above our democratic causes, grounded in power sharing and real checks and balances. And so this poses a challenge for us. The whole idea, as we're seeing in the current global moment politically, the whole idea of accountability cuts across political ideologies. It's extremely malleable. It can be appropriated and harnessed by a wide range of causes. And so it's really up for grabs, which is both an opportunity and a threat. In other words, the very idea of accountability is contested terrain. And this is where COPASA comes in and where all of us come in. We are part of that struggle to claim and reclaim the idea of accountability and give it the pro-people meaning that it can bring to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan. There was an excellent summation of the key shifts within which accountability discourses need to be situated. I'll just have one follow-on question from that, and would invite some brief response to it. I mean, as you've already alluded to, I think the accountability discourses are being shaped and discussions happening in two very different kinds of worlds. So there is this one, and probably multiple worlds, right? And there's one world which is looking at accountability in discussions around good governance and aid effectiveness agendas and so on. And then there is another world which we're talking, which is, the first world being more top-down. And then there is the other world where we are talking about the national and community processes of strengthening accountability and responsiveness within systems and out with those. So the question is, how can those discussions be brought to speak to each other, and should they? And whether you see any dangers or pitfalls in these discussions coming together.
I would bring in a different take on the national arena. I think one of the main threats to our struggles is the capture at the national level of accountability discourses by right-wing forces claiming the anti-corruption banner. And I think around the world, one of the consistent patterns is that progressive forces have lost control over the terms of debate over corruption in particular. And unless national forces can reclaim a pro-people accountability approach to corruption, that we're going to be on the defensive for a long time.
Thank you, Jonathan. So now let's move to the human rights paradigm, because you have alluded to more sort of the messy world of politics. Human rights, or especially when we consider right to the highest standard of health, is an aspirational right and very little justiciability, so to speak. Rajat, you've been using human rights instruments and sort of advocating that through your various associations to be sort of domesticated, applied locally. What kind of possibilities do you see, and what kind of limitations do you see that the human rights paradigm provides in terms of furthering a social accountability agenda?
Thank you, Abhijit, and let me start by thanking the organizers and Kopash for this absolute privilege to be here and to be part of this discussion. I guess in my remarks, what I'm going to try and do is actually point to the several disconnects between what Jonathan just said and how the global human rights paradigm is playing out. But what I would also like to do is start by putting a caveat. Right to health, in my view, is not only aspirational, but it is also justiciable. And I would like to spend a couple of minutes in terms of understanding where the justiciability comes from, but also then question what does that mean in terms of our collective narrative around these issues. As we all know, the fundamental right to the highest attainable standard of health was first recognized 70 years back in the Constitution of the World Health Organization, and then later affirmed in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. We have thereafter have had numerous regional treaties, the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, the Inter-American Charter, the European, and several other ones, which recognize the fundamental nature of health as a human right. There have been litigations from numerous countries around the world, including the Supreme Court from this country, which has actually recognized quite clearly the fundamental nature of health as a human right linked to the right to life of population. But the question that I often struggle with is, then so what? And what difference has it made in terms of lives of the people, but also in terms of shaping the global narrative? And in doing so, I'm often confronted with a narrative which has got several trends in it, which have started to emerge, especially over the last 2 decades, if you may. The first is that while there's, at least at the discursive level, a recognition that health is fundamental to realization of human rights, and the vice versa as well, that you cannot realize health of populations without actually recognizing the human rights of the populations. However, increasingly, what we are also seeing that while this discursive level of recognition has happened, there is also a parallel trend that has started to set in. That is of regressive policies being adopted by states across the world, but it is also in terms of 2 specific points that happen. When we look at the operationalization and the domestic implementation, as you talked about, of the right, we all often have the argument that is being put forward of the context specificity of the country situation, which actually is argued to mean that the right is actually dispensable, not inalienable, as we would like to argue. The second is the trend that is increasingly, at least in the last 5 to 6 years, setting is in terms of a more pragmatic or palatable articulation of the right rather than a more principled approach of the right. And that applies very directly to the concept of accountability, and I cannot say it better than what Jonathan just said. But increasingly, while we are very fine talking about data monitoring aspects of the tick-boxing exercise that he talked about, we are not ready to talk about remedies and redress. We are not ready to talk about social accountability in the same manner that we know that local and community-based organizations are talking about. We also have this trend, which is there in terms of an instrumental use of human rights, where we are increasingly pressed to prove the workings of human rights as against conceptualization that links the realization of human rights intrinsic to human capabilities overall. And in doing so, what we have ended up seeing is a trend, as the French say, is a plus ça change. More the things change, the more they remain the same. And to me, when we then start looking in terms of the possibilities and limitations, and looking at limitations first, I think one of the biggest limitations that we have, and that came out very clearly in the plenary yesterday as well, is our inability at the global level to connect with the social movements. And I think this has been our biggest collective failing, that increasingly the discussions in the global paradigm of human rights have become very Geneva and New York focused, and we forgot that we actually need to work and need to be informed with the communities on the ground. The second point is, and I cannot say it better than what was captioned in David Saunders' last piece in The Lancet, 1 step forward, 2 steps backward. And that, unfortunately, is very true. And that, to me, is reflective of a very disturbing trend, whereas we are increasingly ready to negotiate against the gains that were made over the last 50, 60 years under the disguise of actually setting an agenda that will have at least a more popular buy-in. And the public health care example that he gives in and the comparison between Alma-Ata and Astana is starking. Why did we let it go? And as they started to talk about in that piece, is that what we are missing is an honest, bold, and a true agenda that can help aid those working on health equity around the world. So when you talk about possibilities, There are two possibilities that I would like to help situate that can help us use the global paradigm of human rights to deliver better on the social accountability goal. The first to me is situating health and human rights as inherent to the idea of social justice. Global human rights narrative has to change. It has to change in the same way as it had to change in the 18th century when people made a rallying call for freedom and liberty. We have to have that narrative. We have to have that narrative, as Aruna Roy talked about yesterday, in terms of a narrative that demanded access to information, the right to information, as a fundamental right of the citizenry. The second is that we need to have a collective voice and a collective demand. You know, what I often feel is that one of our biggest failings is the absence of a collective moral outcry and outrage. Increasingly, we are actually being pushed into a more conforming stance rather than a stance that actually demand an outcry, from climate change to Ebola to women dying of unsafe abortions. And this is appalling. But increasingly, what is happening also is that rights of one set of people are pitted against the rights of another set of people to negotiate down the rights agenda rather than to promote the rights agenda. And so to conclude, what I would like to say is that the global human rights paradigm is not a panacea. It's an imperfect tool, but it's a fundamental tool that we need to use. And we need to use it in terms of building that common narrative, in terms of building that common outcry, which is truly radical and I hope non-conformist. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajat, but I'd like to quickly welcome Wilson, who has joined us. Wilson, as many of you from India would be knowing, is one of the founders of and the national convener of the Safai Karmachari Andolan, a rights organization which has been campaigning for the eradication of manual scavenging and the employment of manual scavengers, which has been illegal in India for quite a long time. He is an Ashoka Fellow and also has been awarded the Raymond Magsaysay Award for his work in this field. Welcome, Wilson. Just to brief you, we are having a series of conversations. We'll come to your question in due course.
Thank you, Rajat. Excellent reflections, and also especially the plea for embedding human rights discussions and the human right to health discussion in a social justice framework more firmly. I think I'm going to push you on the limitations aspect a bit more, because we are living in very difficult times. There's a resurgence of a right-wing agenda, a fascist agenda, and there's also a rise of an anti-immigrant sentiment across the world. And I like the point you were making about pitting one right against the right of others. Now, how can a human rights framework be made to speak to not only the rights of citizens, but also those who are rendered stateless or become non-citizens and are created actively by exclusionary policies and planning decisions? We are seeing this across the world, but more specifically, we are in India, and we're seeing the extension of the NRC processes to other states, and some thousands of people being made non-citizens. So how do we, are there precedences within the human rights framework that have been used to protect the rights of non-citizens?
Thanks. Thanks a lot, Anuj. And I would like to start with the specific reference that you made on how rights of one set of population are used to undermine the rights of another set of population. And I would like to take it a step forward. And I worked on something years back in context of housing and shelter and destitution in India. And one of the most starking experiences that we had when we were looking at that whole issue was how rights of the population to clean civic space was used to tender an entire population as the illegitimates of the law. And I want to revisit this concept once again when we talk about statelessness, but also broaden it to look at destitution, but also displacement, which is caused by project-related developmental models that we are looking at, where states uses the conceptualization of eminent domain to illegitimize whole sections of populations. And there are various examples from India and beyond in that regard. But I want to start with recognizing that Article 1 of the UDHR starts by saying, born we are all free and equal in dignity and in right. It does not say, born those who enjoy the comforts of their states are equal in dignity and in rights. It says we are all equal in dignity and rights. So you don't lose your human rights based on where you stay, how you dress up, and whether you sleep on the street or not. Human rights and human beings remain equal in all circumstances. However, you're right, we are in a particularly challenging situation. We are looking at about 14% of the global population living in states of displacement. This is about 68 million people, the population size of France we are talking about, which is rendered to flee their homes because of conflict, climate-related contagion, or other matters. The question then becomes is, how do we actually use the rights paradigm in this regard? And in my view, there are about 3 or 4 different ways in which we can approach the rights in this regard. The first is rights as the framework within which a lot of these conversations are happening, and reinforcing not only that version of the rights framing, but also the version of the rights framing which is inclusive of those that are rendered stateless. Second is rights as protection, as guarantees of protection in terms of safe spaces, in terms of protections against violence, threats, intimidation, reprisals, but rights as protections. Third, and to me most important, is rights as providers of voice, of recognition that everyone matters in the eyes of the law. That voice that you might be rendered stateless, you might have to flee your country or your house, but you still have a voice which is equal to that of everybody else. And then finally, rights as demands, demands to equality, demands to accountability, and demands to entitlement. And there are 2 very quick examples that I would like to give in this regard where we actually have used rights to ensure these changes to happen. The first example that I would like to give is where we had a circumstance in terms of the law of the country was such that it did not recognize certain sections of population to a fundamental basic human right related to health. And that is the example of Ireland and lack of recognition of access to safe abortion for the women living in Ireland. And we had a law which was obstructive, but it took about 3 decades and more, but the law was changed through a referendum. So if the law doesn't work, change it. The rights are there for everyone to protect everyone. The second is the example I would like to give in terms of the Rohingya population and the absolute atrocious violations of human rights that have taken place over the last several years against Rohingya populations, and specifically against Rohingya women, where instances of sexual violence have been rampant and far-ranging. We didn't have a mechanism or an architecture to hold the government to account, and more importantly, to ensure criminal responsibilities in that regard. What happened? We were able to generate enough moral outcry to establish an international architecture, and this is quite unique because the only other instance there it has taken place in context of is Syria, and there is now an international accountability mechanism on Myanmar, which is mandated to look at all the violations that have taken place and prepare files for criminal prosecutions. So what I wanted to say is that rights are tools that we have in terms of challenging the laws that might be obstructive, as in case of the Irish example, or in terms of demanding procedures to ensure accountability, even if the architecture does not exist. Let's have one. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajat. We will now shift gears. We've heard the problems, the possibilities, the need for conversations and bringing them together, the change in the global environment. The next set of conversations will be with grounded practitioners. How have they been negotiating? How have they been taking this process or tool, this possibility forward. I'd first like to have Mulumba come in, because Mulumba is also a lawyer. He uses the law as well as does advocacy and mobilization. So Mulumba, how do you see the challenges of community engagement to bring them into the use of human rights possibilities, to bring them into the governance process? You do a whole range of activities from research to petitioning. How do you get communities to become active agents in this entire process?
Thank you so much. Such a great pleasure being here. And I want to thank the first two speakers that have framed issues in a very empowering way for me, that will be talking about the national level stuff. But I also want to, first of all, talk about two things which I think are important in terms of framing national level accountability. Jonathan made a very good observation on things that have been happening lately, but I think we need to go back a little more on where the problems actually started from. And my colleague tried to indicate some of these. You know, the departure from the original understanding of systems building towards today's approaches of not just systems building, but tackling problems. I think, as the late David has been emphasizing over time, our problems started from a shift away from a comprehensive approach to health systems building. You know, the principles of Almata, the principles of the Ottawa Charter, which all talk about systems building. And you know, the thinking then was that if systems are built, then you're able to tackle the things, and the kind of accountability that you would be envisaging is a bit different. So we were convinced that, you know, a holistic approach does not make economic sense. And at that time, the argument was to actually solve the global crisis, economic crisis. So an approach that envisages tackling things that make economic sense began to set in. So we moved away from systems building to now problem solving. And the problem solving had to make economic sense. And this led us into marketization. The marketization, I think, for me, has led to two fundamental things that we cannot forget and do not need to forget. The first point is around a very disempowered state. The states were completely looked at as, you know, entities that can't deliver, entities that cannot make things happen. And therefore, for practitioners, we begin to see that even holding the state accountable, sometimes you cannot get the results that you want. The states, not just at the national level, but also at the global level, are supposed to be the leads in terms of agenda setting. But when you look at what's happening today, the states have lost that. You know, they will comfortably tell you that the resources are not there for us to be able to handle socio-economic issues and therefore handle their human rights obligations. And I think that's a problem. You will see it at WHO. Who is funding WHO, which is, you know, in terms of health, where you would classically see the role of the state. I think I have been reading around, and they were making mention that when you look at the funding of WHO, I think if you combined Germany and Japan, the money that they give is much less than what Bill and Melinda Gates is giving. So you begin to question who is setting the agenda of health. And in terms of accountability, who will you be holding accountable? And who will be having the power in these dynamics? The state lost all the ownership of property, all the leadership on essential services. In the country where I come from, in Uganda, the state doesn't give citizens water. It came up with a private, you know, arrangement where water is provided to citizens. The state does not give electricity to citizens. It got a private entity from South Africa that is distributing electricity, and it determines where the electricity is going. The state has no role whatsoever in transportation. Now,
These are key, essential issues that we are talking about that would deliver health to citizens. So if the state has moved out of these obligations, it becomes extremely difficult. And it also changes the dynamics of accountability on who is going to be holding who accountable. The core role of the state would actually be to regulate. What we are seeing is that we still have situations in a country where I come from and several other countries in the region in Africa where the state is only regularizing the major player who is the private sector. It's not regulating, it's regularizing. A classic example of Uganda where I come from, it is very rare to have a sector which has a law, a policy, and a strategy for implementation. We have seen that for the PPPs, public-private partnerships, around the last 3 or so years, we have consistently developed a legislation on that. We have developed a policy on it and a strategy for implementation. This has not happened in any sector. You'll find that a sector has a strategy, but there is no policy. A sector has a law, but there is no, strategy around it, and it becomes a problem. So the first point for me is to actually emphasize that the role of the state has been lost. And therefore, the state has become very disempowered, and for us as practitioners, that's the first point that we need to be noting. The second point is around who is this player now, where the state has left. What we are seeing, not just at the national level, but also at the global level, as I have indicated, someone undefined is in charge of things. He is going to come with their agenda. The person is going to come and define the sort of narratives and policies around SDGs, and therefore we have run into conversations on how commercially we can deliver healthcare, and I was listening to conversations yesterday. All our attention has been taken away from systems building to actually focusing on universal healthcare coverage, and we are not looking at universal healthcare coverage. We have even abandoned that and are focusing on financing for health. I think health financing is important, but financing is just a component. But because the major player benefits much more in a conversation on financing, I think that's where we've run. And therefore, all our accountability is running towards that. I think that's a major, major problem that we need to deal with. We have been made to believe that, rights are now aspirational, rights are now things that cannot be realized, and therefore, if you frame health as a right, it's not something that can be realized because states don't have resources. And we are fighting back. We are spending a lot of time writing articles on the justiciability of the right to health, rather than actually going to the principle, as you've indicated, an implementation of the principle that was envisaged in rights. The principle that was envisaged in rights is on humanity. States were supposed to be guided by the principles of rights to take forward humanity. That conversation has been lost as we speak. We are in a process conversation that are really rights making sense? Should we continue to have a conversation on rights? And all the energy is actually now focused on that, which I think is a problem. Because of the departure on that, we have also moved away from the commitments that were actually created as guidance on how the states are going to be committed. And the conversation is not about the commitments of states in human rights. It's actually conversations that are still focused on whether states can afford these commitments. And I think that's, again, wrong. And we need to move our accountability beyond that sort of understanding. I think the rights framework was also supposed to help us to look at obligations beyond our borders, beyond Uganda, beyond Kenya, beyond India, beyond the countries, such that we begin to look at this humanity cause from a perspective of a global solidarity. Now, we can't reach the conversation on global solidarity because at the national level, we are still struggling to see if these normative frameworks that were created can be implemented. And I think it's a lost opportunity. We have focused on poverty. All the policies, I think since the 80s, we had the PRSPs, Poverty Reduction Strategy Papers. We spent a lot of time training technical people back home to be experts in poverty reduction. You know, poverty is huge. We have poverty in India, we have poverty in Uganda, but some things are beyond poverty. You know, poverty. Our president, my president, has a whole program on poverty alleviation. You know, you may give people wealth, but as long as the other key issues are not solved, this, poverty animal has to be, sometimes looked at and measured as to whether it actually makes sense. So I think there is a huge problem there. I would end by saying and calling upon us as practitioners to go back and revisit the understanding of a state. What's a state? And can our focus actually go back to look at a state that builds system, not a state that is disempowered and a state that is inviting other people to come and perform the obligations. And lastly, I would call upon us to begin thinking around working beyond the borders in which we are, working beyond the isolation that we have and the incapacities that we have in our countries, to begin to think about, a global social contract, a social contract in which we hold states accountable and we say that accountability starts at your level. If you've been able to collect taxes, how have you applied those taxes? You can only move out of, your national level to come to the global to ask when you have actually demonstrated that at the national level the social contract is fulfilled, and then we jump to the next stage of the global social contract. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Moses, for reminding us of the context in which we are situating these debates and demanding the right to health. Before I ask you a follow-on question, I just want to remind everyone to join the conversations by sending us your questions on WhatsApp. The number was flagged early on, and we can flag up again, probably. Yeah, okay, great. There's a +91 in front of that. So, Moses, thank you. I mean, I think you've laid out the context very well. There is a hollowing out of state, and there's an increased trend of marketization and also financialization of health and healthcare. We're seeing increasingly donors, and I've been involved with this study where I'm looking at 5 different donors sending out money to the private sector through financial activities. And blended financing and other innovative mechanisms of financing, where a large part of the public money is going to private sector to increase and extend privatization in healthcare. So against that, the backdrop where we are talking about disempowered states, can you also reflect on some innovative practices or resistance and strategies that have been adopted to enhance transparency in these public-private partnership type of engagement in the health sector, and also holding for-profit sector to account for the impact it is having on health systems?
Thank you so much. First, I think it's a mix of approaches. It would be very difficult for me to say that we can make a distinction between national level interventions and global level interventions. The point I would want to make is that national level interventions lately are very much influenced by global movements. In fact, the decisions at the global level determine what we do at the national level. If you wanted to make any interventions today in Uganda and you do not make mention of the word Sustainable Development Goals, you're not going to be entertained in any office. So, certainly, the first thing is to understand what are these global conversations? What do they mean for us at the national level? So I think innovative approaches should be able to envisage that the interventions are happening both at the global level but also influencing the national level as a first point. The second point is that we have traditionally had approaches. I work in legal empowerment and social accountability field. I am increasingly realizing that legal empowerment cannot work in isolation of social accountability. because, social accountability continuously gives evidence upwards. But also, if you overdo social accountability and you're not holding people legally accountable, it's a problem. So I think the second innovation for me would be to see how do we combine these traditional approaches that we've been having in a way that complements each other, such that we move away from saying, I'm a lawyer and therefore what I understand is legal accountability and I'll focus on that. It will not give result if social accountability is not happening. The third point, I think, for me would be access to information. Our empowerment, our accountability starts with information that we do have. The states are signing agreements, the states are making decisions, but in many cases, we as practitioners have no access to this information. And I come as a legal practitioner, we usually, if you're going to court, there are three approaches. You can argue the law where you do not understand the facts or the facts don't favor you, so you argue the law. But if the law does not favor you and it's the facts that you have, you then zero down on arguing the facts. So the facts then lead you to, you may find a judge who is more lenient. But if both the law and the facts do not favor you, then you are resorted to just arguing. So you just make an argument, a very compelling argument. And I think we as practitioners, let's try to get as much information as possible, such that as lawyers do it, if the situation leads you to just making allegations, make the allegation. Whoever has the information will inevitably bring it. The other the fourth approach is moving beyond fearfulness. Because, civic space is closing everywhere. It's, when I listen to India, when I listen to Uganda, when I listen to Guatemala, everywhere civic space is closing in. How do we force that space to open up beyond, not just within our borders, but also outside the borders, in a very fearless way, to be able to handle things? And then lastly, how do we build movements that are grounded in the principles that we are discussing? Because I think there is a lot of interventions that are happening, but very uncoordinated. We have formed coalitions, but these coalitions are still very specific on the things we are working on. And I usually draw a lot of aspiration from the women movement all over the world. Women movements are movements. They will work on land, they will work on domestic violence, they will work on this and that. But it's a movement. As long as it's an issue to do with women, they will all come together. I think as far as something is to do with accountability, let's not over-focus on our traditional understanding of accountability. Let's begin to help each other. Yesterday I was in a session of patient rights, and I kept thinking in my mind, how do I get these community level people discussing here into the community in Uganda to begin to raise forums, use the terms I was hearing that are very compelling to change, the rights of patients. So movement building, not just at the community level, not just at the national level, but global movements as have been envisaged before. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Moses. You have laid out a lot of principles, and we would like to see some of those principles. How do they reflect in practice? Yesterday, Arunaji talked about the devil in the detail, which is finally working down at the operational level, because that's what people experience in their lives. And who better to give us an idea of how those operational details, you've seen it from both sides of the fence. And my question to you, Soumya, is that, now that you're within the SSAT, looking at it from, governments also get brownie points when they adopt so-called good practices. How do you make these so-called good practices substantive spaces for opening up civic engagement? How do you make them, what does your experience in working with the law, with the government, with communities, your heart in the communities, in terms of expanding civic space, in terms of helping this exercise of citizenship that we have been talking about, making it more substantive and delivering the services that we are also talking about?
Take off from where Mulumba left, which is you need to talk with facts. And I think my own experience of moving from a movement, a social movement like the MKSS to government wasn't easy. I mean, the thought that there was a paradigm shift from working outside to working within. But I think what worked in the context of the composite state of Andhra Pradesh was the fact that 2 lines in the law, which I think the MKSS and a whole lot of organizations fought for. In Narega, they fought for just those 2 lines, which is social audits will be done once in 6 months in every Gram Panchayat. Nobody had a clue what a social audit was. Everyone knows from civil society point of view about public audits, Jan Sunwai, but what was social audit? Now, there was one state, a very willing bureaucracy right at the top, and a very willing political space, which was open to considering having a social accountability set up to do social audits. So what started as an experiment, and I was involved in the experiment. I initially stepped in to say, okay, let's see where it goes. The fact that that experiment started in 2006 when the NREGA law was passed and first began to be implemented in the state of Andhra Pradesh and across the country. And now, literally 12 years on, out of which 10 years I've spent as director of the social audit institution, tells me that yes, spaces open up, spaces shrink. There's no doubt about it. Yet, as on date, to be able to carry out a social audit exercise in every single village of a state, making sure that every single rupee that's been spent under Narega is audited by citizens and through facilitators. Again, 90 to 95% of the facilitators in the social audit process are from marginalized communities. I'm very proud to say I follow no roster. 95% of them come from marginalized Dalit families, all of them first generation literate, all of them right there, spunky, ready to question the state. And this is state sponsored. This is something the state is funding, that the state has an obligation towards its citizens to ensure that there is space for people to be able to come and question. I mean, we are electing our representatives. And we begin to fear our representatives once they sit in positions of power. They dictate policy, whereas policy should have been ours. We are the ones who are supposed to decide what policy is. Where is the space for that kind of discussion in terms of, even a pre-legislative discussion to say that this is the law we want to bring in, what is the opinion of the citizens? And I feel, unfortunately, one part of citizenship engages, one part feels that whatever Sarkar is doing is fine. And so I think within that space of social accountability, even something like ensuring that there is 0.5% or 1% funding for these social accountability institutions to be set up. I was very conscious when I set up the organization and named it, that I didn't call it only a social audit society. We called it a society for social audit accountability and transparency, because social audit is only one part of a much larger canvas of social accountability and social accountability tools. Also, the fact that the social audit or social accountability principles are not limited to just one set of people or something that's written in terms of saying, okay, the majority says this. What the social accountability exercise actually ensures is that every individual has the right to speak, every individual has the right to be heard. So if you if you come to any of our social accountability, the social audit public hearings, every individual who has a grievance, either in the Gram Sabha or in the public hearing, is given an opportunity to raise a question. Now, if you look at this in the context of health, we've done fantastically well with schemes like the midday meals, with NREGA, with ICDS. With health, I feel somewhere there's been a tentativeness even from government side to engage. But I feel that this is one space that really needs to open up. We really need to push the boundaries. I mean, just looking back, if you've seen in the last year or two, you've had public instances of doctors working in government hospitals being lynched, being pulled out and beaten up by people who are unhappy. Why is that happening? There is so much of a disconnect between citizens and service providers. There is, everything now is IT based. I mean, like you said, you can send your questions through IT. We are told, aap mat aao. Please send us your, if you have a problem with government, just send us a WhatsApp. Send us a message. I would like an interface. Why do I need to resort to something that is completely, impersonal in terms of these IT platforms? And we don't know whether it's a robot that's sitting there and responding or, a person who's responding. So somewhere or the other, I feel that within the social accountability space, working with government for me has been an experience that we've had great times, we've had really bad times, we've had times when we've been seen as, been treated very indifferently, but we haven't been killed. We haven't been maimed, which means none of our facilitators have ever been physically hurt. In fact, government takes responsibility for both the institution and the reports. And the fact that the institution is still today continuing robust, no matter, I've seen 5 governments come and go in one state. I've seen a state bifurcation happening, setting up 2 institutions parallelly so that no one state would be denied the institution. And I've found that at the end of the day, governments also want to look good. They want, social media has this huge power on the way in which governments respond to what a citizen is saying. They don't like negative reports. I mean, that's also partially the reason why the minute you have a social accountability exercise, the first thing they're worried about is, what is the worst that we are going to hear? I mean, there was a time at least 10 years ago when I remember one of my commissioners telling me, I said, it's not going to be very nice. You'll hear a lot of things that are not going to be very pleasant, especially when you're the implementing agency, you might not like it. So he turned around and said, this is for me like an MRI. It tells me I'm investing so much money, so much effort, so much energy into this program. And if at the end of it, what we are getting out of it is not what the optimum that we want, then this is the best possible way for us to be able to address it. So having looked at the way governments have reacted, and if I tend to sit back at times and crib, because when you've seen something really good and you feel you're going through a bad phase, you feel ki kuch nahi hua hai, nothing's happened. But if I start with just 2 lines in a law, giving us the space to set up a social audit institution, the fact that it's an independent institution, in 12 years I've never been asked to replace a report of mine. Whatever report there is goes on to the public domain as is in Telugu or in English. Anybody can access it. There are no restrictions in terms of downloading it. If you look at the fact that 1% funding has been committed by government, central government now, to this particular institution, if you find that there are social audit standards that have been issued by the Ministry of Rural Development in consultation with the Comptroller and Auditor General of this country, if you see the kind of guidelines, the fact that there is a complete interest in the way in which this institution is going to be functioning and the outcomes of these social audits. Now, in fact, the MORD on a regular basis asks, what is the follow-up? What has happened to all the issues that have come to you all? How have you disposed it? Have recoveries happened? Has action been initiated? Have people been terminated? 36,000 people being acted upon in 10 years in one scheme, in the form of fines, in the forms of being removed from their jobs or suspended or disciplinary action being taken against people. That's not a small thing. I mean, even for a state government or for the central government or for citizens who've been involved in this entire exercise, it's something to feel very proud about. And I think there are times when, as civil society activists, we feel that spaces are shrinking, but we've still got one foot through the door. We just need to put our might to push the door wide open, and I am sure we can push it. Last but not least, I feel that we really have reached a point where, and this goes across all schemes, all sectors, we really need a social accountability law. I feel that citizens, the onus of bringing an issue to government is that of the citizen. What is the government's onus to address that particular issue and say, this is going to be time-bound, I'm taking responsibility for it? That can't be the citizens, that has to be governments. And I think that a lot of us feel we already have a lot of laws. But yeah, where the RTI stops with giving you information, social accountability will actually ensure that any action that comes out of that information by citizens will have to be acted upon by government.
Thank you, Soumya. That was really very insightful. And I think my main question to you is, and especially because you've moved from the movement and to being part of the state, from sort of challenging the state to being part of it, I want to interrogate what you mentioned as also having bad times. And just to reflect a bit on what is lost in mainstreaming progressive and citizens' accountability tools like and establishing a social audit institution. What is lost in that process of mainstreaming? Are there particular limitations that you've encountered in pushing this agenda forward?
I think what is lost is that the minute, this again is from personal experience, I presume just from the fact that I work with a state where civil society organizations often look at social audits as now the state's responsibility and not theirs. I feel that it has to be, we have to walk step in step. It can't be two parallel processes where government says we are doing the social audit process and civil society says, government is doing this exercise. I feel that the power of linking civil society to social audits or to any social accountability exercise is extremely important, because at the end of the day, the reports that we churn out also need to be questioned. I can sit here and say very confidently that I would back that report 100%, but I feel that the minute civil society starts looking at these reports, starts questioning, starts following up, saying, asking questions on those social audit reports and about those social audit reports, a lot of difference can be made, even in terms of getting government to respond in terms of follow-up action, but keeping us on our toes. I mean, what's to stop us from tomorrow getting co-opted by government? I mean, if I was a smart politician, I would just ensure that my person sat in the post of the director of social audit, and then everything would just go my way. So civil society cannot and should not wash its hands off. I think that the power of both social audits and public audits need to keep going simultaneously. So for every social audit that a society for social audit does, a parallel accountability exercise should be undertaken by civil society to see whether what we've done or what the report that we've put up is robust, whether it is, it's done the fact checking properly, whether it is honest. And so I think that's been lost. I don't know about other states, but definitely in Andhra and Telangana, I keep, that's one battle I have with all my civil society friends, saying, question us, ask us, look at our reports, make sure that, at the end of the day, we don't become completely complicit with the state in terms of saying, all is well, we've done social audit, it's all clear. So.
Thank you. We cannot outsource social audit to the state. And I think that is, while we mainstream, this outsourcing cannot happen. And without, I think the message is loud and clear, without a social movement owning that process and keeping a constant pressure, in this interrogation, it may become routinized, and that's where I'll use the social movement conversation to talk to Wilson. Wilson, you've been part of a social movement with the most marginalized communities. You're not from the health sector, and that's one of the reasons why we have you here. But health is something which is integral to the well-being of the communities and the movement that you are part of. Do you think social audits, the issues of transparency, actually hold a promise for a better life, a realization of rights, their fundamental well-being, as a mechanism which also works for the Safai Karmacharis? Give us a reality check.
See, I apologize that I came late. Then second is about this is an area where we are talking about the health, and we also tend to think that we are not part of the health like, but no citizen can be out of the health sector. Without the health sector, then there is nothing any sector. It is every sector is linked with the health. Then second is accountability. So the problem here, when you take the context of India, so India and Indian civil society and Indian government here, the accountability in the sense it is an upward accountability. So you are accountable to the person who is sitting on the top. So we don't have anywhere even just a small iota of the understanding that we are accountable to our citizens. That we don't have, unfortunately, in the governance. And there may be one or two places or some institutions that is like a paradise somewhere here or there. That has not lost after the Milton. The paradises are there, here are there in certain departments. I do agree for that. But in all the sectors, there is no accountability as such. I am not delivering this to my citizen, my fellow human being, and I am accountable for that. That understanding I have not seen in the governance in India. Because I am also almost like a 35 years with mostly working with the government. Government always think that I am against the government. Of course, that is their stand. I have no problem. Because the government think that when somebody is starting questioning, they think that questioning is an against. That is a misunderstanding, misconcept that we cannot help. We have to make the whole governance to understand that the questioning is also part of actually to make the things on the possible way to take it for. That is, we are struggling. From S.R. Shankaran is a retired IAS officer who passed in 2010. I worked with him almost like 18 years. So there I have seen very closely with the IAS officers and particularly the sector, how they are thinking about the people and all. So if you take the state and even the private sector and the global institutions, all three together also, or separate ways, how they are accountable, what are they actually. The private sector first I will take. Private sector always think that they can replace the government and we can do the things. That is a danger for the most marginalized sections in the society. I am coming and I am representing, I am also from the same manual scavenging community, so I know actually what are our requirements. I am not even using the word the rights. Of course, we do have a rights, there is no doubt, but requirements as sanitation workers. So many private sector institutions now, they come within a cooperative society, this, and they introduce a contract labor, and they, see, that's what I want. You want to provide the health and the sanitation facilities to the right to sanitation for other citizens, but at the same time you are violating the rights of the people who are providing the sanitation. So we go in the one direction. We don't see that what are the implications on the marginalized. I think that this symposium here, we have to make a very clear eye or the view how we are suppressing, oppressing and violating the rights of the most marginalized societies, communities across the globe. So that angle we are not taking. We are thinking how do we reach? We want to construct the toilets. Oh, construct toilet. All the ministries construct. And you will not see that whether those things are required for them or not, number one. Number two, who are going to clean all those things? You never see that. And you claim that you have the double, twin pit, triple or 4 pits for the one toilet. You can claim. But in the reality, everybody knows in the country that we don't have many places, even a 1 pit for the one toilet. Please try to understand. Most of the toilets are connected with the drains and all. So this is the fact. But you construct and you say that we are doing. Then you are perpetuating again the manual scavenging. Somebody has to come and clean that. And there the people are dying. You have not even have a single word about the people died in the sewer line and septic. This is not the small number I am talking about. If you have any one number, 30, 40 people died here or there, it becomes a national issue. 1,870 citizens died in this country in the sewer line and septic tank. It is not even an issue for the any upper level. So you don't talk about that. So you talk about the rights of someone, you are ultimately you are violating the rights of others and you are taking away the life. It's not just right. Article 21 Indian Constitution says right to live life with the dignity. But the manuals come in that sewage sanitation worker, where is the right? And another thing is, when you are constructing and doing all these things, you develop a value that open defecation free. Who brought this? You know that this is an international agenda. Open defecation free, banana, wo karo, ye karo. So, okay, you also adapt that. I have no problem. But the thing is, you have to study your local situation, where you have to do that. And you declare 98% of India is the open defecation free today. But the same country, 1.6 lakh women still they are carrying the human excreta in the dry latrine. So where is the point of having the dry latrine and declaring the open defecation? What is this? For whom we are declaring? So my question is, we are not accountable to the women who is cleaning the shit after 75 years of independence. So that question you don't talk about. So who actually, why they have to clean the shit even today? Is there any one reason to say that? Then second is, to achieve that, you develop that nobody should defecate open. Why somebody will come and defecate open if they have the facility to use the toilet with the privacy? 90 lakhs are staying in the roads and the streets, homeless. So where they will go? So you have no public toilet system facility anywhere. And you have the toilet system in the slums. How? It is the, actually you have to pay and use. In India Habitat Center, we don't pay the toilet charges. You go use and flush and come back where we have afford to pay the money. But where the slum, where the people cannot pay, there you introduce 5 rupees, 2 rupees or 5 rupees. So how they will pay and use? So you don't think anything. And another is to achieve this, all these things. You develop that nobody should anywhere. And in Shivpuri in Madhya Pradesh, somebody came and they said that there are the 2 children who are defecating outside. In that name, they came and they killed. And you can use the word lynching or you don't want to use the word lynching. But literally you killed 2 children in Shivpuri. For what? They are polluting the place. But what is the truth? The people, the children who died both are from the Balmiki community, scheduled caste. And who cleaned this country? The people who cleaned 5,000 years this great country, and those children, 2 children, the same community, 2 children, in the name of the clean, you are coming and killing. This is the value. So what are the actually where we are making the mistakes? That we have to take as a stock. We don't talk anything. We want to just achieve target. Targets are not for the UN. Targets are not for somebody, other international agencies. International agencies must start thinking fast. In implementation, there should not be any human rights violations. State never going to talk about the human rights. The international agent. Second, private sector, they have to facilitate the process of the welfare state. It is not alternative to the state. And the state must actually turn back and look actually how do we actually accountable to our own citizens, particularly the marginalized, voiceless.
Thank you, Wilson, for helpfully reminding us of bringing back the discussions and quite firmly embedding it in the issues of marginality and the rights and violations that the marginalized are experiencing. I think I just want to unpack that notion of marginality a little bit more, and I want to understand, so you clearly alluded to the issue of caste. I also want to understand how the movement has, and to what extent the movement has addressed the intersections of the social locations of people who are in the manual scavenging. To what extent have women's voices been part of the movement, and how the strategy have addressed the intersections of caste, of gender, of class, and other issues. So if you could just reflect a bit on that.
See, India is a very, it is a, in whole world, there are certain kind of discriminations in the name of certain things. Maybe race, maybe something else. India has another peculiar is the caste. We cannot ignore the caste. And you do some kind of a work here. Even development or sanitation, health, water, whatever, you touch even the wind or anything, you have to address and you have to look from the view of the caste and of course patriarchy. They both are very, very strong in Indian society, and without touching that. And as in a Safai Karmachari Andolan, this movement mobilizes with women only mostly, and all of them are marginalized, and particularly Dalits and the scheduled caste. There is no doubt at all. And the judiciary also in the country, they don't look into the lens of the caste and the gender. They pass the orders and all. When they are also now wanted to actually review the act, so review and the amendments of the act on the basis of how we can escape from the clauses in the act. It is not actually bringing the more rights perspective. No, now you think that the progressiveness. Now our progressiveness is actually how can we wash our hands? We have learned from the WASH program maybe, but we washed our hands from the accountability. So this is a thing which is everywhere. So this thing is actually, so we have to put these two parameters, the caste and the gender, very clearly in everywhere. And health also, I want to make one point here. We do work in the 10 slums in Patna Municipal Corporation, with the Patna Municipal Corporation and United Nations Population Fund, along with them, the group of the people are working. There, actually the health is a major focus in doing this. Child marriages, never enrolled in the schools, and all these are almost like 80%. So it is, we are talking about the capital city. And the health facilities, the municipal corporation or the government supposed to provide, like one ambulance. It is taking 9 months, still there is no ambulance. So we do make a big plans, but we are unable to actually deliver even a small things which can provide the minimum basic amenities to the citizens.
Thank you so much, Wilson. I'm doing a rethink about what I thought would be a more democratic process. Either we have been extremely enthralled with what's the conversation here, or we have been reluctant to ask questions, because we have not received a single question. Oh goodness! Okay, social media, please, technology, we need, like every time and everywhere, technology has huge birthing problems. So I think we'll have to. Huh? Okay, I'm so sorry, but I think we've had a very, very stimulating panel. It's come at the issue of citizenship, it's come at the issue of governance, it's come at the issue of accountability from very, very distinctive points of view. And I don't want to do any kind of summary, because that would be disrespectful in many ways. What I would like all of you is to hold these questions, hold these thoughts during the day. Because what is important is there have been deep interrogation and also spaces for hope. And we do, as we talked about yesterday, we are after all professionals of hope. So without that hope, we would be just cynical, we would not be here. So holding on to those questions, but holding on even stronger to the hope and the issues that have been flagged by all our 5 panelists here, I do hope you go through the rest of the day and the symposium and are able to get deeper answers, more meaningful insights for yourself. And together, I think the important point is when we talk with marginalized communities, it has to be solidarity, solidarity, solidarity. Thank you all, and let's now have tea. Sorry for that move up on technology.
I didn't used to look any better. Thank you.
Not to worry about
Hello everyone. Can I have your attention for a minute, please? We have some admin announcements. So those of you